This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 45 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, November 5th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. George W. Good, that's spelled with an E at the end, have closed their camp at Forge Pond and gone for their customary winter sojourn in New York. The pleasant fall weather has made it possible to make a long season at camp. Miss Eva Pyne, that's P-Y-N-E, was an over-Sunday guest at the home of Mr. and Mrs. George Rose in Cambridge. Mr. and Mrs. James W. Pyne have been recent visitors at Mr. and Mrs. Sawyer's home in Dorchester. Mrs. Sawyer is Mr. Pyne's sister. Mrs. Arthur H. Hazen and Miss Gertrude Hazen of West Hartford, Vermont, have been spending the week at the Congregational Parsonage with Reverend and Mrs. David Wallace. Mrs. Hazen is Mrs. Wallace's aunt, and Miss Hazel, her cousin, and their home is in Mrs. Wallace's native town. Mrs. Clifford Bass and Mrs. William Bragdon of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, have been guests at Washoba, W-A-S-H-O-B-A. I don't know whether that's a misspelling of Neshoba or not. At Washoba Farm this week, and were present with Miss Foster at the Tadmont Club on Tuesday afternoon. James E. Gill of Ludlow, Vermont, was an over-Sunday guest of his sister, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher. Master John Gill Fletcher has been on the sick list and under the doctor's care with tonsillitis this week. He had recently turned 19 years old. A number of Westford patrons attended the Pomona Grange session at Littleton on Wednesday and were also present for the conference of the fifth degree. I guess that should be conference of the fifth degree, and the entertainment in the evening. The next section is called Tadmont Club. The regular meeting of the Tadmont Club took place in Library Hall on Tuesday afternoon. Miss Sarah Loker, the president, who has always been so constant and prompt in conducting the club sessions, was detained at home on account of Mr. Augustus Bunce's illness. He was Miss Loker's brother-in-law. And Miss Ella Hildreth, the vice president, was unable to be present, having to meet a business appointment, which she had deferred from the previous day in order to represent the club at the Littleton Federation meeting. The secretary and treasurer, Mrs. Leonard Wheeler, presided at the routine business and reported pleasantly the meeting at Littleton on Monday afternoon, after which Frank H. Hill, superintendent of schools, was introduced and addressed the large audience on, quote, conflicting ideals in education, end quote. It was a comprehensive, earnest, and thoughtful presentation of a vital subject and fully merited the careful and appreciative attention it received. At the next meeting, one of the programs of the special season study will be carried out. This is the one in the group under Spanish North America, entitled, quote, The Aztecs and Montezumas, end quote, of which Miss Edith M. Lawrence is chairman. This afternoon's program is changed in place of Mr. Bailey's, quote, The Minister in Fiction, end quote, which he will give on February 21st. The next section is the About Town section. The Old First Parish Church will hold its annual fair and entertainment next Friday afternoon and evening in the vestry of the church. There will be all the usual attractive tables with articles for sale. Supper will be served from 4 to 6. Later, there will be a concert and a dance. The music will be extra fine by out-of-town talent. David Bilson, the expert engineer at the Fletcher Quarry, while trying to adjust some electric wires on a motor engine last week Friday, accidentally touched 2 live wires, which made him less live than the wires for a few minutes. Workmen close by were unable to loosen his hold of the wires until the current was shut off. He was rendered unconscious for a few moments, but soon rallied. Sounds like he was pretty lucky to me. Judging by the last rally day for registration, there will be a large vote cast next Tuesday. 18 persons were registered Saturday afternoon and evening. Daniel H. Sheehan has started his apple bruiser, and the flow of juice is more abundant than water in Tadmunk Brook, where sitteth the mill. This is a reference to Sheehan's Mill, which is or was located across the Lowell Road from the Pelatiah Fletcher House at 54 Lowell Road. The mill's foundation and the mill pond can still be located there. It's a nice hike. The saw and grist mill at Westford Station would be busy with logs and cob corn if a rain would only add a little to the pond. As it is, the sound of the grinding is very low. There were several mills along Beaver Brook at this time that depended on the brook's water flow for their power, and apparently the brook was very low now, or 100 years ago. Barn dance is the next section. The sporting element of life that loves ball games in town had their annual outing indoors at the town hall last week Friday evening, and the Westford Athletic Association in their barn dance attire never looked more businesslike or pleasure-like. The hall was also uniformed for the occasion with jack-o'-lanterns, corn, all kinds of farming implements, and rural greenness generally. The Colonial Orchestra of Lowell, also in barn dance uniform, added to ye old-time days of barn sociability. The judges were John Hutchinson of Littleton, Joseph Wall of Graniteville, and Mrs. Clara Grieg of Westford. I presume they were judging costumes that were worn that night, but it's not too clear. Much additional merriment resulted from the presentation to the association of 4 sketches of this wonderful ball-playing team by Miss May Balch. Dancing was enjoyed from 8 until 1. Chelmsford, Littleton, Lowell, and the surrounding towns were well represented. Next, we have the Forge Village section. A number of men have been engaged the past week raking up the streets and making new sidewalks. As a result, Pond Street and Bradford Street present a very tidy and neat appearance. The work is being done by Abbott and Company. A little grading and raking around the Cameron School would add considerable to the appearance of the building. New cement sidewalks were laid in front of the school when it was enlarged 2 years ago, but the lawn in the front and around the school remains in a very unsightly condition. The cellar windows are also left unsafe, and an iron railing should be placed around them to protect the children. A little attention paid to these things would be greatly appreciated by the teachers and parents. Of course, the Cameron School is still there and now serves Westford as the senior center. Reverend Max L. Kellner of the Episcopal Theological School at Cambridge, Massachusetts, conducted the services at St. Andrew's Mission Sunday afternoon. It was announced during the service that Reverend Arthur L. Bumpus of Belvedere, Illinois, would be in charge of St. Andrew's Parish November 6th and would conduct the services at the mission at 4:30. A letter was sent from the former parishioners of Mr. Bumpus to Bishop Lawrence and was sent by the bishop to Reverend Mr. Kellner, who read it to the congregation on Sunday, recommending Mr. Bumpus very highly. A cordial invitation is extended to everyone to attend the service next Sunday and meet the newly appointed vicar. Edward T. Hanley, Fred A. Sweat, Elmer E. Nutting, James Sullivan, and John Carmichael spent Saturday and Sunday as the guests of Julian A. Cameron at his summer residence at Essex Island, making the trip in Mr. Cameron's automobile. Mrs. Hugh Daly went to Leominster on Monday to attend the 18th birthday party given her daughter, Miss Gladys Daly, by her aunt, Miss Elizabeth Dufour, on Monday evening. Mrs. Daly also attended the reception last Friday of the Leominster High School teachers to the parents of their pupils. Miss Daly is completing her last year at high school. Daniel Sullivan of Boston spent the first of the week with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Sullivan of Pond Street. Miss Miss Christina Lowther is spending this week at Worcester as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. William Baker at their home on College Hill. Philip and John Morton of Lowell were entertained on Saturday and Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton on Central Street. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met at Recreation Hall on Thursday afternoon, and after the usual work, a very pretty luncheon was served, which concluded with a social hour. The members of the John Edwards Hose Company held their regular monthly meeting at the Hose House on Wednesday evening. The money made at their recent dance was turned into the treasury, and plans were discussed to hold a concert in the near future. Mrs. John Baker, who has been confined to her home by illness, is somewhat better. Meadow, it's spelled M-E-E-D-O-E, Meadow Canton has purchased a strip of land from Mr. and Mrs. Richard D. Prescott on Union Street and will build a 2-tenement house immediately. John Carmichael has purchased a strip of land joining his residence, which gives him a frontage of 132 feet. Next, we come to the Graniteville section. The song service that was held in the long sought-for chapel at North Westford last Sunday afternoon was very largely attended. The services were conducted by Reverend Y.J. Oldecker of Boston, while Reverend Lewis F. Havermel of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Graniteville, assisted by Lucy Blood, a member of that church, had charge of the Sunday school. Albert E. Day presided at the organ during the services. It is the intention to hold services in the chapel every Sunday afternoon during the month of November. Sunday school will commence at 2:30 p.m. to be followed by a song service from 3:15 to 4 p.m. All are cordially invited. The spirit of Halloween that means so much to the young people was observed here in various ways. At several of the homes, many of the old-time tricks and charms were tried over again, while many of the youngsters paraded the streets in the early evening with jack-o'-lanterns and other contrivances appropriate for the occasion. A regular Halloween party under the direction of Miss Engla Matsom was held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. John Matsom in West Graniteville, the proceeds of which will be added to the treasury of the Epworth League. That was a youth group at the Methodist Church. Many young people from this village attended the big Democratic rally in Ayer on Wednesday night. Mrs. Julia B. Wall of Cameron Circle, that's the circle of the Companions of the Foresters of America, of Graniteville, and Mrs. Julia McCarth of Lynn visited Ayer Circle on Tuesday evening. The next paragraph is called a rousing rally. A rousing Democratic rally was held in Healy's Hall in this village on Thursday night of last week that was largely attended by the citizens of Westford, Littleton, Chelmsford, Ayer, Acton, and surrounding towns. Edward Fisher, chairman of the Democratic Town Committee and candidate for representative in the 11th Middlesex District, was chairman of the evening and introduced as the first speaker Councilman Frank M. Farmer of Lynn, who delivered a very spirited speech on state issues. It was certainly an interesting subject. After the chairman had given a little inside information to the methods of the opposite party, Philip A. Kiley of Lynn, candidate for senator in the 7th Middlesex District, was introduced. Mr. Kiley gave a clear, concise explanation of the different issues, comparing his record with that of his opponent, Frank P. Bennett, Jr. of Saugus. His remarks were followed with close attention, and judging by the interest shown by the large audience present, his works made a great impression. The next speaker was a man that the people here have been long anxious to see, and when the Honorable John J. Mitchell of Marlborough, candidate for Congress in the 4th Congressional District, was presented, he received an ovation. Mr. Mitchell did not talk on woman suffrage or quote scripture, but came right to the point at once, and the reason for the high cost of living, as explained by him, left no doubt in the minds of those present that he has a thorough knowledge of the subject. From a personal standpoint, Mr. Mitchell is a striking figure and an able orator, and aside from his political faith, it would be a pleasure to hear him deliver an address on almost any subject. He certainly made a great hit with the people here, and at the conclusion of his address, the applause lasted several minutes. Taken on the whole, the rally was a success in every way, and those who attended will surely profit by it. After serving in the Mass House and the State Senate, the Marlborough lawyer John Joseph Mitchell served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1910 to 1911, and again from 1913 to 1950. There's a nice Wikipedia article about him, along with the picture, if you want to see what he looks like. Next section is called the Harvest Supper. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church held their annual Harvest Supper and entertainment in the church vestry on Thursday afternoon, and the affair was largely attended. The supper was in charge of Mrs. Maria Wall and served from 6:30 to 8 p.m. and was up to the usual high standards sustained by the Ladies' Aid. After supper, a very pleasing entertainment was given under the direction of Henry Smith. The program was varied and well-balanced, and several of those that took part were obliged to respond to an encore. Miss Alice Gilson was the accompanist during the evening. Owing to previous engagement, the pastor, Reverend Louis F. Havermale, was unable to be present. Both the supper and entertainment were highly enjoyed, and the different committees in charge, as well as those who took part in any way toward the success of the affair, are to be commended for furnishing a very enjoyable evening. Following is the program. Piano solo, Miss Madeline Holland. Vocal solo, face-to-face, Miss Rachel Wall. Reading, Mrs. O.A. Nelson, that's Oscar A. Nelson. Song, The Songs My Mother Used to Sing, by Miss Bertha Wilson. Piano solo, Sweet By and By Miss Ruth Furbush. Quartet, Who Will O'er the Downs, Mrs. Charles W. Wright, Henry Smith, Frank Conter, and Oscar A. Nelson. Reading, Peck's Bad Boy, J. Everett Woods. Vocal solo with chorus by the audience, Mother Hymn to Me, Henry Smith. Henry Smith was quite known not only in the Methodist Church but throughout town for his singing. That's the news in Westford for the week ending November 5th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.